And well, I first of all would like to thank you, Tunne, Kelam, and the Konrad Adenaueri Foundation and Patria for inviting me to speak here. And in fact, in a way, I'm having the last word of the three speakers here, and feels just like at home, where I also have the last word. The last two words, to be precise. And these words are, yes, honey. So I could leave it at that now, but since I did prepare a PowerPoint, I'll let you at least enjoy some of my pictures. And please forgive me for repeating things that have been said before. This is, I think, the natural side effect of a conference like this, where speakers, so many speakers talk about this subject. So if you ask me, what is European? You know, I think probably a Japanese or a South African or a Californian would, first of all, picture the beautiful castles in a beautiful landscape, and that's Europe to him or her. Maybe it's the European bureaucracy, of which Henrik, you know this, so you see this every morning, is a part. And the propaganda poster here, they change it every week, and I'm sure there are three well-paid officials who come up with a new idea for the pep talk poster of the week. This one here is to welcome Slovenia in the Eurozone. Or maybe a church for sale. A church which is for sale. Maybe that's European. Or maybe this poster, you remember it was about like 6-7 years ago, there was an ad campaign in England and Spain and some other European countries, paid by atheists, and the ad read, there's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy life. I'll come back to the content of this later on. But, I mean, maybe the European social model, which includes the right to strike, is very European. Or maybe the singing revolution and what it stood for is the soul of Europe. And that brings me to the much larger question, which has been touched upon by earlier speakers, but maybe not really discussed intensively. Should we not first and foremost talk about the West as a whole, and not only about Europe? Or maybe Europe as part of the West, you know, recognizing all cultural and political differences that may exist between Europe and North America. Nevertheless, and Dr. Patria this morning emphasized this, nevertheless, Europe's closest ally in every respect in this world is America. So let me just take you briefly through 4 steps of reflections on the soul of Europe. And briefly, where do we come from? What are our roots? Next, how do we relate to other cultures, to the rest of the world by interaction? How can society be influenced? And this is very important because, you know, we're talking about values. And really, we have 80–90% agreement here among ourselves in this conference today. What I would like to talk about, maybe a little bit like Hubertus Hoffmann, is, I mean, how do we get there? What are the instruments to get these values across? How do we get people to change their egoistic, selfish, soulless behavior? I think that's much more important than to repeat, constantly repeat to ourselves and to each other that Europe should somehow rediscover its soul. And fourth, then just a brief rundown of what I consider the main challenges for the future. So we have Greco-Roman traditions, we have Judeo-Christian faith, and we have the Enlightenment, and that came up a couple of times. The gentleman on the left is Immanuel Kant, actually from a place not too far from here, from Königsberg, Kaliningrad. And the happy gentleman on his right is Voltaire. And let me just remind you of some of the key points that they made, which could characterize the Enlightenment, in my view. And actually, Immanuel Kant himself he defined the Enlightenment as the liberation of man from his self-induced dependency, die Befreiung des Menschen, nein, der Ausgang des Menschen aus seiner selbstverschuldeten Unmündigkeit. Very deep sentence, very deep language. It's something that, you know, you cannot arrive at completely without the basis of the Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian traditions, but it goes beyond that. And as such, I think is a positive project for which Europe stands, for which the West stands, which we have to work on all the time, and which is something positive. The Enlightenment is not something that in itself was a step in the wrong direction. And I think it's, as long as we remember this and put the Enlightenment in the chain of traditions that define Europe, I think we're on the right track. And Voltaire, famous statement, I do not agree with what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Tolerance. Now, let me just briefly show you a document, the EPP party's platform, that I contributed to over the last 2 years, which was adopted in Bucharest last October. And how does the EPP platform deal with the Enlightenment in general, but more specifically, the relationship between religion and politics, between church and state? And here is the original quote. We reaffirm the link that exists between Christian values based on the gospel and Christian cultural heritage and the democratic ideals of freedom, fundamental equality between all human beings, social justice, and solidarity. So that's the link here. Now, next step. At the same time, we emphasize the separation between church and state and the need to distinguish between the roles of the church and the state in society, as well as between religion and politics. And then, to make it all crystal clear, the gospel is not a political platform. And indeed, this is the strategic difference between Christian Democrats and political Islam as it is embodied today by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Tunisia, the Gaza Strip, and many other Middle Eastern countries. Now, that brings me now to the question of other cultures, the other, if you want, the interaction between Europe and its intellectual traditions and other traditions in the world. So again, a quote from the EPP platform, freedom and responsibility, fundamental equality, justice, truth and solidarity, as well as subsidiarity. Definition of what we stand for, our basic values. Now, we consider these values universal, not exclusively Western, although they historically emerged in the West and developed in dialogue with other cultures. I think this is extremely important. And this is something that we constantly come across today when we talk about democracy promotion, or maybe more politically correct, democracy support in other parts of the world. It is completely useless to sell these things as Western values, because the West, as such, is not in such high regard anymore among, for example, the youthful protesters in the Arab revolts. However, they can and they do subscribe to universal values, which are the ones quoted here on top of this quote. So I think this is very, very important. Of course, ultimately, there is a logical snag, there is a paradox contained in this whole thing. If it's totally universal, then Europe cannot define itself by it. If you say that Christianity is a global thing, then Christianity cannot become the characteristic element which defines Europe. And I have no ultimate answer to this. You know, of course, Europe is based on Christian, like other traditions, but let's never forget about the universal claim that is there, both in Christianity and in these values, in these basic human rights that we believe we have discovered, but which do not only exist in Europe. And, you know, the first external influence, if you want, was actually Arab science before the Middle Ages, in the early Middle Ages, And indeed, even ijtihad, which is reasoning in Arabic, which is some very rudimentary ideas about philosophy. And in that respect, in these two fields, some areas of science, mathematics, astronomy, and so on, as well as rudimentary elements of philosophy, it can be said that the Muslim world in the year 1100 was further advanced than Europe. So let's never forget that. Colonialism it was part of the dialogue between Europe and the rest of the world. It was a very painful part of it. We have to remember it. And this is another thing that when we talk about Western values and the superiority or whatever one may say of the West, let's not forget that much of the rest of the world remembers us collectively, not individually, but remembers us for colonialism, among other things. And yet, today, we have influences that go in the other geographical direction. This picture was taken in Molenbeek-Saint-Jean, which is about 5 metro stations from the place I work in Brussels. And you see all the women in this picture have a veil, and this might as well be a souk, a marketplace in some Arabic metropolis, and yet by the buildings you can see it's good old Brussels. So that definitely is something, and then of course globalization, about which you could make a 3-day conference in itself, but just to remind you that globalization is where all this interaction is actually played out today, and immigration into our countries, in fact, is part of globalization. So let me now come to the tools and the instruments, and this is where really I believe that maybe we should devote some more thinking to. And of course, family is a core, it's a value in itself, but it's also a tool where values are carried on to the next generation. And I chose this picture and not like 4 happy people smiling into the camera, because in fact, in my definition, family is above all, it's the place where generations take responsibility for each other. That does not necessarily mean that it has to be 2 parents and many kids. But there we are already in one of the current debates on what defines the soul of Europe. Education, obviously, is one of those tools. And then civil society, and this is a picture of what we call a Stammtisch in Germany. It's where people, younger or older people, sit around, meet regularly and discuss whatever, sports, politics, or arts. But civil society and its structures is definitely one of the tools through which Europe can reaffirm its identity and its soul. Challenges, now obviously it's been mentioned many times before, the cohesion of our societies is at stake. It is at least being challenged by the Euro crisis and by other developments, the shrinking middle classes, more divergent levels of income, although the estimates are very different on this, whether we really have a growing gap between rich and poor, but much indicates that indeed the good old second half of the 20th century was probably exceptional in terms of most West European societies having a large middle class and then smaller groups on top and below. That may be a thing of the past, and it will create more social conflict, which is why cohesion and the values that inform that cohesion is all the more important. Islamism, radical Islamism, this is another picture from Belgium, is another challenge. I could talk about climate change, I could talk about different other global phenomena, but I mean, of course, aging societies is one. On the left, you have the population pyramid, age-wise, of 1910. This is in Germany, but much of Europe looks the same. The second one is in 1999. You see the birth rate shrinking since about the 1970, and the projection for 2050 looks completely different from 1910. So, but I don't have to go into detail here. You know that this is one of the major challenge. And here's one thing that we haven't talked about yet today, or only briefly. we will wage wars. We are waging wars at the moment in Mali, in Somalia, in Afghanistan still, and potentially in a couple of other places in this world. My prediction is that the old 20th century differentiation between peace and war is dissolving. We're going to have permanent military action for the foreseeable future. Now, in what German historian Heinrich August Winkler called post-heroic societies, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with killing and dying in a society which has less cohesion, which has less consensus on basic values, and which has less belief in transcendency, religion? Again, we come to a paradox, because of course, you know, at least Christian religion in the last 100 years had very little to do with military efforts. And yet, if there is no immaterial interest that's recognized by at least the vast majority of society, it will be extremely difficult to justify our soldiers killing others and dying themselves in the battlefield. So this is a big challenge, I believe. And now let me just come back to this poster that I showed you in the beginning, that there's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy life. I have two things irritate me about this, and here I'm sure we have consensus among all of us. Now, first of all, this word probably, it's a little bit half-baked, you know? I mean, if you're atheist, I mean, go for it, you know? Say there is no God. Okay, fine, that's an opinion, it's legitimate. But there's probably no God, what does it mean? That's less important for me. The second one is, you know, I know a good many people, and many of you here in the room probably, who would start worrying if they were convinced that there is no God. And they would consequently not enjoy life. And as I think with that, on that happy note, I would like to end my roller coaster ride through the soul of Europe. Thank you very much.